So first, the claim that the objections to the bank with respect to the enumerated powers came late in the process, I think is extremely interesting. It's a change in the way it's normally taught, and so I found that to be quite interesting. Now, the sort of second claim there, that there were a range of views in the legislature on, a variety of different issues. I think that's probably true as well, although Randy makes some good points, and I don't know how to assess all of this. But not new, at least to me, not to people who have read debates. Right, there's these early debates. You often read people and you're like, what are they saying? And there's a range of different views on things, and these are better debates than the 14th Amendment, obviously, where it's even worse. So not that surprising. I sort of wonder about it sometimes because why is that going on? And some of it, I think, can be explained by the fact that they're talking in the legislature, right? Contrast that with the sort of careful views that come out of the cabinet's review of the bank, right? So when people are required to write matters, when they're not, they're also leading thinkers, you get a much more sort of developed argument as to these things. And so it's not surprising that there would be a range of views. And at least for people like me who think that there were differing views, and that the correct answer is, as Randy mentioned, the question is, what's got the strongest evidence for it? What's the best reading? The fact that there's a range of views in the legislature, especially a minority sort of viewpoint, I think is neither new and doesn't necessarily move me that much. And then there's a sort of third point I understand about the enumerated powers, and I understand this is sort of central to your project, but to me, the paper works, at least as a paper, better sort of not talking as much about that aspect of it. I mean, Randy mentioned, there's, and the references to the enumerated powers argument throughout, and the way prior to the discussion in the bank, and about the bank. Madison talks about it right from the very beginning, as you discuss in the paper. And so now I'm not sure you sort of clarified your arguments here, but the way the paper reads, it seemed to me that there was a big claim about the questioning of whether or not framers believe generally in the enumerated powers, and I found that to be the weakest part of the paper. That the paper would be more interesting to me without that portion of it.
Thanks. So I wonder if we can and should distinguish between objections to the enumerated powers principle that you're trying to canvass and evidence of instead a slightly different objections to what I almost want to call the legality principle. That is, the objections to the enumerated powers principle would be the national government is not one limited to enumerated powers. Objections to the legality principle might be, well, maybe it is, but who cares? We're going to make the bank anyway. Because some of the pieces of evidence you have, especially the pre-bank debate stuff about Madison, strike me as maybe stronger evidence of the second. So I take it that's Madison's skepticism of the ability of enumerated powers to constrain the legislature, as Randy says, might really just be skepticism whether people are going to follow the Constitution anyway on anything they actually care about. And indeed, the fact that if it's true that the sort of constitutional objections to the bank are very late breaking, that might be further evidence for Madison's despondency, that once everybody decides they're going to create a bank, they just don't worry about the law until Madison starts making them do it. And you might think those are really the same kind of thing, but it seems like it's something different. And that's, I think, Madison's also account of the bank under the Articles of Confederation. That there was a bank under the Articles of Confederation. There was even less of a plausible case that it was empowered by the Articles of Confederation. But he says during the bank speech, we all just did it anyway because it was necessary. And so it seems like that's floating around in here too. And I wonder if acknowledging that different argument and then figuring out which of your evidence points to that and which points to the other would be helpful.
Hey, Chris.
So maybe those are just things that this paper isn't about, but I was really wanting to see more discussion of and didn't. So one of them was the herein granted stuff, which textually I just think kind of hits you over the head when you're reading the Constitution. Do we have a general legislative power? No. First operative paragraph, all legislative powers herein granted. So people who deny the enumeration principle, they're not well informed if they're not dealing with that text. So the first thing I do, looking through your paper, I Control F, herein granted, and you mention it once as a way to answer an analogy to the removal power. I mean, if these people aren't talking about, they're not talking about the relevant textual question. It just seems when it came out, September 17th, 1787, this is perfectly obvious, and anybody who doesn't explain that away isn't dealing with it. A couple other things. The 10th Amendment drafting debate, September 1789, the powers not delegated. Again, this is discussed in Kurt's piece. Third thing, it's not the bank debate, but the debate over prohibiting slavery. There's the consensus really gets established early in 1790 that Congress can't prohibit slavery, and that's just the central example of something the federal government can't do. And it makes no sense under if you don't have an enumerated principle, and it's a central example of the internal limits canon. So discussion of where that fits in with this history would be nice, but it's already super long, and I'd understand.
Okay, so all super helpful. It took me a moment to relocate Mike. So I won't respond to everything. I'll just say a couple of things, and maybe I'll take it in reverse order, Chris, because yours is fresh in my mind. I'll just say this about two of the things. One, I have a different understanding of the herein granted language. Right? We all know it's there, right? So it seems to me that the text doesn't say Congress may exercise only the legislative powers herein granted. Right? Those aren't the words. The words are all legislative powers herein granted are vested in a Congress of the United States, which I read to say no legislative powers granted in this Constitution are vested anywhere else. It's a different proposition, and John Mikhail has longer conversations about that as an alternative reading of the language. And I think it's a reading of the language that most people don't reckon with at all. I think it's a reading that speaks to concerns that people had at the founding, right? Because one of the objections to the founding during the ratification process is that the Constitution flagrantly violates the traditional principles of separation of powers, right? The Senate is doing judicial things, the Senate is doing executive things, the Congress has been assigned all sorts of executive things, right, that used to be things that belong to the king. And one can read that language, I think it's sensible to read that language as saying, look, maybe somewhere in this Constitution we give an executive power to someone who's not the president or a judicial power to someone who's not the court, but we never give a legislative power to someone who's not the Congress. There are also inside baseball history of the process accounts of how the language gets there, which doesn't speak to what the legal force of it is, right, once it gets out. The other thing is, I think that I think the gravamen of your point, Chris, here, and often this gravamen is exactly right, is these people, if this is what they're doing, they're all doing it wrong. And I want to make the suggestion that sometimes when a bunch of people are doing something and it looks wrong to us, I want to reconsider, are they doing it wrong? Or do I come in with an unwarrantedly strong assumption about what doing it wrong and right in this circumstance is, right? I think you're right, those are two different things. Those are two different things. And I think, and your raising the point tells me that I need to be more clear in the paper about there being two different things, right? My understanding is that Madison is on about the first thing and not the second, right? That is to say, Madison's skepticisms about enumerated powers are practical. Does this work? Right? Does this get us what people think? And some of his reasons to be skeptical include the bank under the Articles, right, and the Western Territories under the Articles and so forth. He's seen this movie before, right? Now, that's not irrelevant to the question of constitutional design and what you think the machine you've been built has done, right? Because smart people try to avoid building machines that they expect to do things that they can't do, right? Or at least not to rely on them to do things that they think this mechanism doesn't do. But that does not mean that Madison doesn't think that the legal force of what is written is a limiting enumeration, right? It just raises a reason to think we would understand, like, if he is skeptical that it works, we should also take that into account in thinking about what it is that he expects it to do. But it is a different thing from the legality principle. What I wonder, but haven't worked out yet, is about the mapping of the legality principle part to the internal limits canon. Or, I mean, the Larry Solon part of my brain says, this is now about constraint and not about fixation, right? They just say, if what we think is going on with all these other people are saying, yeah, but that doesn't bind us, then there's a whole different level on which we wonder, like, is the enumeration limiting, right? But and not one that I've embarked on right here in this paper. Mike, I hear that I have not, as a general matter, persuaded you to give up the enumeration principle and the internal limits canon, and I'm severely disappointed. That's okay. That's okay. I think I have more doubts than you do about not whether leading people at the founding had this set of ideas. Clearly, a bunch of leading people at the founding did have this idea. I have more doubts than you do about how universal and how confidently the view is held, and the calling the role of people, of famous supporters of the Constitution who assert the principle, doesn't fully dispose of the question for me. In part because I think, they have an audience that they're talking to, right? And about people whom they're trying to convince. This is a larger conversation, disputed conversation, right, about how to understand evidence of what people say in that kind of combat. But fair enough. The one thing that I do want to pick out specifically is the very interesting. This actually has got to be right. That when we look at this evidence, we need to remember that we're talking about legislators talking, and you want to contrast that to the cabinet. And so here's just what I want to suggest about the cabinet. I think one of the weirdest arguments in this whole affair is Jefferson's. That's just a weird memo. That is a memo, the reasoning of which seriously challenges me. I have a reaction to that memo that's analogous to the reaction that Chris has to the debate here. I look at Jefferson's memo and I say, I do not know what this man is doing. They're just like a bunch of really lousy arguments here, one after another. So one possibility is that I'm just wrong about that, and he's responding, he's like perfect, he is actually perfectly cogent and thoughtful. But I think it's also possible that it's not actually a cogent, thoughtful, well-reasoned, attentive piece of constitutional reasoning. There are any number of things in the Jefferson corpus that fail to be careful about these things, and I think that fits in. So though I agree that it is important to remember they're talking the way legislators talk, I'm not sure I can get on board, certainly not on this evidence, with the idea that the cabinet discussions are systematically more careful. You may have a higher regard for the cogency of the Jefferson opinion than I do.
I agree with you about, maybe not to that extreme about Jefferson, but I don't like Jefferson's opinion either. I think it's badly done and overstated in many ways, creates straw men that other people can easily attack than Madison's position was. But it was Chris's piece actually caused me to think of an objection to your paper that I hadn't occurred to me before, that you actually are going to need to address. It won't take you long to address it, but you're going to have to address it. Because Chris said, if they didn't talk about here and granted, they're not doing it right. So I had it in hard copy. I couldn't do Control F, so I don't. But I can tell you, I've just reread the debates. I don't think anybody mentioned here and granted. So one possibility is they weren't doing it right. But there's another possibility, and that is nobody thought anybody was contesting enumerated powers. Because if they thought that anybody was contesting enumerated powers, they'd have started talking about here and granted. Now, Richard has his reply. He has his reading of here and granted, which is different than what you might say is the other reading of here and granted. But you're going to have to put that in the paper now, I think, because I think that's the only way to get out from under the objection that here and granted was never mentioned, meaning nobody was questioning all those things I said. They weren't questioning enumerated powers, and the quotes that you say talk about, they also weren't contesting. It wasn't contested, therefore they didn't need to talk about it. That's the other possible inference. You got to raise that, and you got to give them your idiosyncratic reading of here and granted as your answer.
For your information, after 3 questions and responses, we still have 10 people in the queue, and the next 3 are Christina Mulligan, Judd Campbell, and Mike Ramsey.
So there seem to be two possible explanations for why Madison doesn't bring up the bank not being constitutional until as late as you say, and I feel like the discussion kind of merges them, and they're 2 completely separate possible reasons. So one is that, like you're arguing, there aren't limited powers of Congress, but a second possibility, which you also sort of suggest, is just that Madison doesn't think that the bank might not be within the powers, right? And given that most of the evidence is evidence of omission, it doesn't seem like the idea that Madison really doesn't think there are internal limits is necessarily the best or stronger explanation than the other one. And so maybe that says interesting things about what people, how strong the bank arguments were, but I don't know if that says anything interesting about the idea of limited powers in general, especially when you write in the article that it's possible that it seems quite reasonable that Madison thought that just because you would often exceed the internal limits didn't mean there would be no internal limits. And that seems to be a perfectly plausible reading of why it's still worth having them in there, even if you think they're just parchment barriers.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is something you need to talk about in the paper, but it's a thought that's inspired by the paper, and maybe it'll be helpful. I'm trying to think about how we ought to think about constitutional change and constitutional disagreement at the founding, and particularly about Madison. And so one way of thinking about it is that there are just constitutional principles and interpretive principles and interpretations and so forth are empirical facts. And there's some disagreement about the empirical fact, disagreement about language, disagreement about what they had agreed to before, and so forth. Another possibility, and then there are sort of political things that are happening outside that are causing people to make disingenuous arguments. So that might be an account of constitutional change. Another possibility, though, is that a sort of meta principle of interpretation was, as Hamilton explicitly argued, this Constitution should be interpreted in promotion of the public good. And then you have a set of disagreements about what the public good entails. Those disagreements give rise not just to differences of opinion among the founders at a particular point, but potentially to evolutions in how particular founders might have thought about something, like whether the enumeration principle exists or how robust the enumeration principle is, and so forth. And so internally, within the founders' own system of constitutional thought, there is some room for constitutional change, changing ideas, maybe changing priorities, even if there aren't ideas, and so forth.
Christina asked the exact question that I was planning to ask, although much more eloquently. So I could just pass, but I think instead I'll pile on. I think to restate, the question is, this just focuses on the part of the paper that focuses on the fact that the objections to the bank, the constitutional objections to the bank, the enumerated powers objection to the bank were not the first out of the gate in terms of people objecting to it. And why would that be true? And one way would be that one reason would have nothing to do with whether there was or was not an enumerated powers principle, but it would be just that people sort of assumed that it was part of the powers until they started thinking about it. And one reason that they might think that does strike me is that because the articles had the bank, and the general proposition was that the Constitution was supposed to be strengthening, not weakening the national government, so they just sort of assumed, well, the articles had a bank, we can have a bank, and then they started thinking about it more closely and thought, whoa, wait a minute, that could be a problem here. And so just real quick, maybe also to focus, because I'm a little bit of a Hamiltonian, to focus on the Hamilton piece of this. So you say that that Hamilton didn't defend the bank on the enumerated powers principle in his first cut at it. And that could be because he didn't believe in enumerated powers, but it could be, again, that he thought that enumerated powers, that it was sort of obviously within the enumerated powers, or at least he didn't want to bring it up and sort of give ammunition to the other side and to see what other people said. But he didn't think this was enough of a problem that he needed to anticipate it. And then I think it's further interesting when, and again, as you say in the paper, that Hamilton then, when he actually grapples with this, what he chooses to do is engage head on the enumerated powers. It seems like that if indeed enumerated powers was a deeply contested proposition, that Hamilton could have made a lot of hay out of that. If he thought that there were a significant number of people who supported the bank but had doubts about whether it was encompassed in enumerated powers, it would have been very much in his interest, and I think perhaps within his temperament, to say, look, don't worry about this enumerated powers thing. That's just something Madison made up. But he doesn't make that argument, and that suggests to me that he sort of knows his audience. I think Hamilton's very good about knowing his audience. I think he knew his audience, and he knew his audience was that enumerated powers was an assumption. He wasn't going to fight that. He was going to fight on the easier ground that it was encompassed with enumerated powers. So I guess I had some doubts on those lines about that piece of the paper, but I did want to conclude by saying I did really like this paper. This is the kind of stuff I really like, and it's just really a pleasure to read. So thank you for the paper. Thanks.
These are all really good, really helpful. Let me say something briefly about Mike and Christina's together, because there's a common thread. It's not my contention that Madison makes up the enumeration principle or the internal limits canon for the bank debate, right? And it's not my contention that it was a proposition that was out there that he rejected, to which he converted for the bank debate, right? It is my view that he's skeptical about the efficacy of enumerated powers for limiting legislation, and therefore that it's a little odd for him to argue this is the very characteristic of the system. No, like I agree here with Randy. Madison's a process limits guy, right? Like I think he's exaggerating the importance of this mechanism relative to his own prior views, but I don't think he rejected the idea before that the enumeration would limit and converted to it, nor this will breach to Judd, nor do I think he's doing it just disingenuously, right? What I think he comes to late is the minor premise, right? One of the things that lies beyond the enumerated powers is the chartering of this bank, right? And this, I think, is quite consistent, Mike, with your suggestion. I think this is my view also, that what's going on beforehand, before this objection gets raised, is people assume that it's within the enumerated powers, right? Maybe for the reason that you mentioned, right? Maybe William Maclay, overtly gives us this reason why. I'm sure he's probably not the only one. For one reason or another, I think that's right. Most people, until Madison gets going, assume, well, I don't know if they assume or if they thought it through. Most people think that it's within the enumerated powers. And the move that Madison makes late is to say, actually, it's not. Now, you can say what's happening in that dynamic is, we didn't think about it before, but now that we think about it, we realize that it really is beyond. Or you can say that what's going on is, we didn't think about it before, and we were right not to think about it because it was within the limits. It is within the enumerated powers. But we are now using this technology to solve this problem, right? And it's going to lead us, not in bad faith, right, but through argumentative moves that we would not have made before, not have thought of before, right? Motivated reasoning or good ones, we can argue about, right? To argue that this is beyond the enumerated powers. I also very much agree with you about Hamilton knowing his audience, which is to say the two memos are written for two different audiences. One's for Congress in general, right? One just for Washington. And I agree with you. I think my intuition, I cannot prove this. My intuition is that he trims in the memo to Washington because why bite off the bigger thing? right, when he can win the smaller thing. And I think he has intuitions about how Washington thinks about those things. But I'm out of my depth now. I can't prove these things. But I want to clarify this. My point about the first Hamilton memo is not, well, my point about the first Hamilton memo is this. I don't think that I don't think that Hamilton denies that people could raise enumerated powers arguments in Congress. I think he knows people raise enumerated powers arguments in Congress. He saw the removal debate. I mean, not in the room, but he knows it happened, right? People are going to argue that things are beyond the enumerated powers in Congress. He just doesn't think that they're going to argue that this is beyond the enumerated powers of Congress. And I don't think that he's keeping his powder dry, and I don't think that he's not a keep his powder dry kind of guy. I don't think that he thinks, I don't want to raise this because I don't want to give ammunition to the other side. Like, the other side is Madison, and I think, like, chances are, if there's an argument that a reasonable, smart person is going to find, Madison's going to find it. I just think he doesn't think of it at all, and Madison is more creative than he is on the moment. And here, to Judd, I think probably creative in perfectly good faith, and I think it's not a disingenuous evolution. There's a how many metas question, right, about your question. But let me try it this way. There's a lot of scholarship on Madison's constitutional evolution, right, in these years, right? Rakoff has a take, Wood has a take, right? Noah Feldman now has a take. Rick Hills has a book in progress with, I think, a wonderful take that I recommend to the room. I think someone could say the evolution's bad faith, it's politically motivated and so forth. I think that's too simple and not right and uncharitable. I think that his evolution is good faith constitutional, right, about the sense of what the Constitution requires, given now that I see how the mechanism is working. What I'm interested in to talk to you more about is the idea that that's not just built into how one thinks about the Constitution, but is a separately identifiable interpretive principle, right? That is interesting, and I had not thought about it before, so I want to hear more about that.
Just a quick thing that I thought about putting in the paper, and I just didn't have time to put. There's no room for it. And when I was reading this thing about Madison coming to the idea late, and this is Mike's point about they didn't really. He might have assumed it was constitutional until he really thought about it. I just was so reminded of the individual insurance mandate, where I read this Wall Street Journal op-ed, and I read that said it was unconstitutional. And in my mind, I said, look, if that's the best argument that it's unconstitutional, then it must be constitutional. That was my conclusion. And then I was on the Politico blog, and we had to the next day. And we had to debate whether that was true or not. And some jerk, I won't mention who it was, wrote this jerk blog post about how no serious person could possibly think that this was constitutional. And I had to decide whether I was going to say anything about it. And I thought, this is such a jerk. So it's like, I'm going to say something about it. So I said, let's start at the beginning. What does the Constitution actually say about this? And then by the time I was done with it, there was the argument for the individual mandate is unconstitutional. And if it hadn't been for that jerk, I don't know that I ever would have thought about it hard enough to come up with that argument. But I certainly think it was right before I thought of it, and I just happened to think of it late because it took that guy to get me to think of it. And so I don't know that there's that much to be gleaned from that. Certainly not that the enumerated powers principle was contested.
I think that Randy's last intervention here is the single most important thing that anyone is going to say in this session.
I'm not saying anything more. I
have a brief question I'm going to ask Randy during the break, but let's go on to the next group, which is Kurt Lash, David Upham, and Laurie Klaus.
Great to read the paper. Great to continue the conversation here. By the way, my response to Richard, the sum of all delegated power that some people have mentioned is at the Yale Law Journal online. I'd love to get comments because I think this conversation will continue. Reading your paper, it just seemed to me this wasn't about the bank at all. It wasn't about enumerated power in the bank. This is a paper about Madison. And so another title is The Original Meaning of Madison. And that's what we're after. I mean, this is a commonplace, as Jack would talk about. This is an honored figure in our constitutional history who plays a very important rhetorical role. And so it matters to originalists to get him correct. And And so I'm glad for a paper like this, to push us through all the arguments that Madison was making, because that'll help us understand Madison 1. But I think there's a Madison 2 that we also have to at least think about, that originalists have to think about. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about this, because there are two ways that Madison could be important to us. One is the Madison of the founding. What were his intentions? What were his ideas? Have we got him correct? What was his thinking about the Constitution? Maybe we're wrong about his thoughts about enumerated power being foundational to the Constitution, and that's what you put on the table. Now, it's very complicated trying to figure out what to do about that, because are we talking about original intent? How much does original intent matter? But it's still something that all of us want to get right. But Madison 2 is the Madison that had an impact later on, right? And so whether or not we have a correct understanding about Madison, what is the commonplace Madison? What is the understanding of Madison that later on has an impact in constitutional debate and constitutional development? Because one of the things, and this is, I wonder whether or not you're going to get to this as you forward your project. A Madison has developed by the time you get to Reconstruction, right? And it's not a Madison of the complications of the of executive power and the removal power. It's not a complicated Madison of pre-point in the Philadelphia debate before they gave states equal representation and what Madison was afterwards. There was no complication at all. By the time you get to Reconstruction, there's an accepted view of Madison as the presenter of the dual constitution and dual federalism that should have been preserved by both North and South, but which was betrayed by Calhoun and betrayed by the slave states that wanted to nationalize slavery. And so Madison becomes a figure representative, or this is a possibility, okay, right? This is a possibility, and I'm getting a lot of this from work that I'm doing in Reconstruction, but it can be challenged. There's a possibility that, and it seems to me that the Madison of Reconstruction actually isn't complicated at all, and was a Madison of representing the enumerated powers Constitution. If that's true, and I know we're just asserting this, if that's true, how do we grapple with that Madison? Even if the Reconstruction people got Madison wrong, because they didn't have the insights that you're presenting here, don't we still have to grapple with that second Madison?
Just a first point is kind of an echo or it's an elaboration of both what Chris and Kurt said about the precise scope of the project. At times I was wondering, okay, why doesn't he talk about this? And then I said, okay, well, maybe if it's Madison, you could say there's a really interesting argument you can make of the development of Madison's attachment to or interest in or belief in enumerated powers. But at times it seems as if you are suggesting that and I know you're not saying that here, but when reading it, it's suggesting that somehow the Bank of the United States is the moment where it becomes important for many, if not most, rather than just simply Madison. And in the colloquy, you mentioned, Hamilton's audience. So then first thing that came to mind just this past week, I was teaching Washington's first inaugural, where he does talk about the designation. These are your defined powers, and this is what you're supposed to do, what's enumerated. But that may not be part of your project. So there's so many, the other project would be enumerated powers at the founding, or, which, my gosh, good luck. There's just so much to go through and to try to get a handle on. The second point is just a variation on a theme here, and that is, wouldn't the way in which people respond to Madison's seeming late arguments suggest that they already had a lot of power? Because almost immediately Hamilton and others want to go right after him on this point, which suggests that maybe there's a kind of latent consensus that is not at the surface but is right beneath it. But once it's brought forth, then everyone focuses on that issue.
Yeah, so in analysing the evolution of Madison, I think you'd be helped to flesh out the Madison at the convention a little more, with at least two other interventions that follow in weeks subsequent to the one you describe. At the moment when the Madison's favoured congressional veto over state laws is discussed. Multiple other note takers at that point. A lot of people are taking notes. He's the only one who has the discipline to keep going. But a lot of them are taking notes, and you've got, I think it's 3 or 4 of them, recording him as saying, no line can be drawn between the nation and the states. And Mary Sarah Bilder makes the point that he omits that from his notes. But not just Yates, everyone else gets that. Everyone else says he said no line can be drawn as the reason why they need the veto over state legislation. Again, showing a deep scepticism of the prospective enumeration project if it were to be followed. The second thing is when the Connecticut Compromise is getting proposed, William Samuel Johnson, says to Wilson and Madison, well, unlike Hamilton, you're claiming you're not wanting a completely centralised system, but how are the state governments to preserve their ongoing role in the system if they don't have effective control of at least one chamber of the National Congress? So Johnson's proposing a true political safeguard of federalism. What's Wilson's response to that? The obvious response, if you were a believer in a power-limiting enumeration, would be that. The power-limiting enumeration will do the trick, and that's not his response. His response at that point, about June 15, I think it is just pure centralism. He just says, well, should that concern arise, be realised, the people of the nation won't be less free as members of one great republic than as all these little ones. He just goes with, people in Virginia are as free as people in Delaware. Doesn't matter if a republic's big. So at that point, he's a rabid centralist in that proposition. He's not at that point showing any scope for seeing enumeration as a power-limiting principle, really.
Okay, so we have less than 1 minute left, and my charge is to try to keep us on schedule. So could you respond briefly to those comments, and with apologies to those of you on the queue that we haven't had a chance to get to?
Thank you. And maybe I'll just stop there, or maybe I'll say to Kurt, because it's the easiest one to develop in the time. Yeah, exactly. And I think that the question of how we struggle with that, and those various matters, I think that is a very serious question that originalists need to contend with. Right? I definitely have that view.
Okay, apologies to John McKyle, John Harrison, Don Drips, and Jeremy Tolman. I wish we could have heard your questions, but thanks to all those who have participated, and thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.